Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our second day of our Languages for Specific Purposes event, organized by our local research group, NELFA, here at our Faculty of Languages, Linguistics, and Literature, PALI, here at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, UFMG. So today we have two outstandingly special guests who we invited to keynote on this event. I myself had the great honor to work with both of them 2 years ago in a joint project with our Laboratory for Experimentation and Translation, LETRA, here at UFMG. So our first guest is Professor Dr. Maureen Ehrensberger-Dow. So Dr. Ehrensberger-Dow holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Alberta in Canada. She's a professor of translation studies at the Institute of Translation and Interpreting at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences in Winterthur, Switzerland. That I had the pleasure also to visit 2 years ago. She has been a leader of various research projects, including the recently finished initiative called Cognitive and Physical Ergonomics in Translation. She's currently involved with the Cognitive Load in Interpreting and Translation project, or the CLINT project. And also takes part in the larger project on digital and machine translation literacies in Swiss universities. Our second guest who will be joining Professor Ehrensberger-Dow in this talk is Dr. Alice Delorme Benites. Sorry about my French. So Benites has a PhD in applied linguistics from Zuriche University in Germany, and is a lecturer in French and translation, and also at the Institute of Translation and Interpreting in the Zurich University of Applied Sciences. So her research interests include translation, innovative didactics, and the use of machine translation by the broader public. She's currently working on a project to strengthen machine translation literacy at Swiss universities, along with Professor Maureen. So our keynote speakers today will deliver a talk entitled The Importance of MT, or Machine Translation Literacy, in Academic Writing. I'm quite sure that this is going to be a very fruitful experience, and we are eager to learn about their interesting insights on this topic. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to my dear guests. So please welcome Dr. Maureen Ehrensberger-Dow and Dr. Alice Benites. Thank you very much for this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonardo, for the very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here today. Alice is going to be sharing her screen for the presentation that we'll be giving, and I'll start the talk, and then I'll turn the floor over to Alice. You can see me in this picture. That's a bit accidental. It was a publicity shot because we needed some slide titles, and I was asked to show what multilingualism meant. And you can see there's an American flag in front of me and a Swiss flag, and the Swiss flag is accurate. I indeed have Swiss citizenship because I'm married to a Swiss man and I acquired Swiss citizenship, but I'm Canadian. I'm not American. Just in case you're wondering about my funny accent, when I say things like about, you'll hear that that's not a typical American accent. It's very much a Canadian accent. And Alice is in the French group at our institute, and we actually met not professionally, we had met already within the Institute, but in a research context. We met when we started chatting about research possibilities, and she said, oh, and by the way, she spoke Portuguese. And I thought, what? Okay, because right then I was interested in doing something with UFMG, with Fabio Alves, and then I said, Portuguese. She said, no, Brazilian Portuguese. I said, okay, we need to talk. So this is the background of how Alice and I came together to be doing this work. And if we go to the next slide, I first want to acknowledge the reason I was able to work with UFMG and the interaction that Leonardo mentioned, that he was able to come to Winterthur, was thanks to bilateral research cooperation funded by the Swiss government. Research cooperations were encouraged with the Latin American region. And in 2006 and 2019, Fabio Alves and I were able to acquire funding that allowed us to start talking about cooperations. And what we will be talking about today is funded by a program within the Swiss University, the Swiss pendant to something, I can't remember what it's called now in Brazil, I did know, that organizes all of the universities within the country. So it's the umbrella organization. And I think you have one in Brazil as well. And that's been funding the research that we're going to be talking about today. And of course, all the participants and colleagues are our partner universities. I want to acknowledge them at the very beginning before I start talking, because without them, we couldn't have done any of this work. In the next slide, I've outlined how UFMG and ZHAW, which is the short form for Zurich University of Applied Sciences in German, the Zürcher Hochschule für angewandte Wissenschaften, the cooperation to date, these are just the formal cooperations to date. So in 2013, Fabio Alves invited me to come to Palais de Lettres for a research stay. I had a sabbatical and I spent some time working with fabulous PhD students at Lettres. And then as a result of that, we signed an agreement between our two universities. And that was the first university-wide agreement for us. It was not the first for UFMG, but it was the first one for us to have a university-wide agreement for research cooperation and exchanges. And one of the PhD students from the Lettres group came to us for 6 weeks and taught a post-editing course, which was the first time we had taught post-editing of machine translation at our institute. And that kind of kick-started our interest in that. And then the workshop that one of you mentioned in 2016, Ergonomics and Technologized Knowledge Work, a rather fancy name. We were basically trying to extend the work that we had done with translators and extending it to knowledge workers of all types. And I think that the pandemic, sadly, in the past year and a half, has made ergonomics very, very much part of our life, that a realization that sitting in front of a computer screen for hours on end, we talk about Zoom fatigue, people have realized that the chairs are not as comfortable that they're sitting on as they should be, and they might be getting back problems, they might be getting neck problems. And so we wanted to open up that discussion, not just to translators, but to anyone who does knowledge work. And I think all of you in the audience can relate to that. You're all knowledge workers. In 2018, I came back for the imprint seminar, and I think I met some of you in the audience potentially. I can't remember exactly how many people I met, but I had an opportunity to talk to quite a few people about ergonomics, but also about our interest in digital literacy and machine translation literacy. And this idea, this potential cost of ELF in academic context, this is the project that Leonardo was involved in very closely, that Alice got involved in, and we had a PhD workshop, and we were looking at ELF, English as a lingua franca, that people who are forced to write in English who don't have the benefit of your teaching, the ones, those of you who are in the audience who are teachers of English for special purposes or English for academic purposes, where people are having to process information in English when they're not very competent in English and having to produce English texts. What is the cost in terms of stress, but also in terms of cognitive load? Does that overload people in a way that they can't produce the kinds of communications that they actually would be capable of? And Leonardo has the lead on a co-authored paper that should be submitted, I think, Leonardo, probably next year. We were very ambitious at one point and thought possibly in 2020, possibly 2021, but I think the goal probably is now 2022. So that's the background of UFMG and ZHAW, which I think explains why Leonardo asked us to give this talk. And then to give you some background of what this digital and MT literacy is all about. In 2019, I acquired funding to look at digital skills, and it was, I didn't realize how prophetic it would be at the time, because in 2018, we wrote the proposal. In 2019, we received the funding and we started it. And what we were looking at was trying to get our teachers' digital skills a little bit more advanced. A lot of our teachers still were very uncomfortable with using e-learning platforms. They could handle basic things of computer literacy, of course, but they were not integrating digital skills into their teaching in a way that someone like Alice has shown us is possible. In retrospect, it was fantastic that we had this funding and we were able to start working with our teachers before we were forced online, because it's turned out that our teachers in our institute were much better prepared for the switch to online learning and teaching than our sister institutes were, and we'll be publishing those results in a little while. Out of that project came the idea to look at digital literacy in a broader sense, so digital literacy in university context. And we talk about the new digital literates, the generation of students that we're working with who are so literate digitally that we don't have anything left to teach them. And it's not that simple. The digital natives may be very comfortable with social media, they may be very comfortable with the internet, but they may not be terribly literate. They may not really understand what value those resources have, which resources they should trust. And what we're interested in is academic literacy practices. And this makes me feel happy because it takes me back to how I started my career, because I actually started teaching academic writing way back when I graduated with my PhD. I was working in an English group and we were focusing on advancing people's academic literacy. So I've come full circle in a sense. But what we're looking at is the role of digital tools and how those can help and how they can be dangerous, but basically how they can help. So we started this project 2021. It's a very generously funded project. It's with matching funds, so half from our universities, there are 4 universities involved, and half from the Swiss universities, the federal financing program. And in 2021, we started in January full steam, mostly thanks to Alice. We sent out a survey on MT literacy to the 4 universities that were involved, 4 consortium universities, and we had possibly not overwhelming responses, but we were very, very happy. 3,580 responses that we can use. And that survey went out in German, French, and English. You may or may not know that Switzerland is a multilingual country, not just in 1 or 2 languages, but in 4 official languages. And perhaps surprisingly to some of you, English is not one of those. It's German, French, Italian, and Romansh, which is a small language, but very easy to understand if you're Portuguese. But English is the lingua franca in the academic world in Switzerland, the way it is in so many places. And the first survey we put out in German, French, and English. So translation played a strong role in this, of course. And we also developed the survey in those 3 languages. It wasn't really just sending out for translation afterwards. It was developed with an eye to translation. And based on those results, we fine-tuned the survey, I would say. We changed some of the questions, and it's now been extended to all other universities in Switzerland who are willing to distribute the survey, which is not a trivial problem. Trying to get surveys sent out at universities, maybe it happens at UFMG as well. There's so many people interested in people answering their questions that we're overwhelmed by the number of surveys. But it's ongoing, and the responses are starting to come in, and probably by the middle of 2022 we'll be able to talk about that in more detail. But we already have lots of things that we can talk about. From 2022 to 24, and this is past my retirement, Alice will be taking over. There will be interventions, people will be trained in MT literacy, there will be evaluations of those interventions, and then dissemination of those findings. We have a dedicated website, Diglit. If you put Diglit, D-I-G-L-I-T, and ZHAW into your Google search, you'll find us very quickly. So what is it? What is digital literacy? Well, there's something called the DigComp, which is the Digital Competence Framework for Citizens. That's been around for a while in the EU. There has been a recognition that literacy in the sense of reading a book is crucial for citizens, but being able to handle information. This is something that Gary Massey, the head of our institute, and I got interested in quite a few years ago. Information literacy, in terms of all that information is out there on the web, but not all of that information is equally valuable, is equally valid, and training people in being able to judge, being able to evaluate information is an aspect of literacy. The same with data, being able to evaluate the validity of data, the reliability of data is an aspect of literacy. And the competence framework includes communication and collaboration as part of the competences for digitally competent citizens, being able to create digital content, understanding the safety issues associated with digitizing information. I would add the ethics of that as well. And problem solving is something that the DigComp framework says is very important for citizens in terms of digital literacy. There's another framework, the core, what have been identified as the core 21st century digital skills. Van Laar et al. In 2017 published on this. And you can see there's quite a bit of overlap with their list of the core digital skills and the DigComp framework. So technical skills, information management skills, communication collaboration skills, these are human skills. So we're not outsourcing everything to the machine or to digitalization. It's very much a case of humans in the loop contributing their own expertise, uniquely human expertise, communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, and problem solving. And if your teaching of ESP is anything like mine, I discovered that teaching academic writing often meant teaching problem solving skills, critical thinking skills, creativity sometimes, and certainly communication. But it happened to be in English, which wasn't the native language of the students I was teaching. But a lot of what we were working on were these skills. We didn't call them digital skills, we called them literacy, basic literacy skills. So what you're doing and what people are talking about as digital skills will be very familiar. When we talk about MT literacy, so machine translation literacy, this is something that came to my attention when Lynn Boker started talking about it. She's published a book in the meantime called Machine Translation and Global Research with a colleague of hers. And they came up with some basics of what they mean by machine translation literacy. And their whole point was this idea of English as a lingua franca. How could machine translation leverage the communication skills that a lot of researchers have that are maybe not good enough to have their articles published in high prestige English language journals, how could they possibly use machine translation to help them on their way? And their definition included the basics of how machine translations process texts. This has become more interesting with neural machine translation and harder to understand, but it's the basics. How these systems are used or can be used to not just produce text, but to find text. So what maybe putting in search terms into a translation, an MT system like Google Translate or DeepL, if you're familiar with DeepL, how you can use those, possibly putting your keywords in your own language and then find the keywords if it's English that you're interested in, and then use those English keywords to find your search. If you find an article that you think looks interesting, maybe you need to run it through one of those engines just to access it in your own language to get a sense of, is this interesting? Is it worth my making the effort of trying to really read it carefully and understand it? Abstracts are a nice length to put into a machine translation tool, for example, and decide, aha, is this worth wasting my time trying to read it? If your reading of English is slow, then it really is a cost to decide to read something like that. I can read French, but Alice knows my French is very, very poor. But I can read French, but it's a lot of effort. And so it would be nice to know from an English translated abstract, okay, is this text really worth my while to make my way through it? So comprehending the basics, understanding how they work, and then appreciating the wider implications associated with the use of MT. So this is where our idea of training really starts taking hold. What does that mean if you start using MT? If you want to use MT to help you understand it, you can evaluate how machine translation friendly a text is. If you want to use MT to produce a text, so maybe you write in Portuguese and you want to produce a text in English, you could learn to evaluate how well written your Portuguese text is to produce a good English text from that system. And if that's called pre-editing, the next point, create or modify text so it could be translated more easily by an MT system. And when we say more easily, MT systems don't care. They don't have it easy or hard. But when we say more easily, or when Lynn Boker said more easily, she meant more effectively, so that the output is more usable. And then once you have the output from the system, knowing what to do to improve its accuracy and the readability. So I'm going to do a little bit of MT literacy training. I apologize to those of you in the audience who are already MT literate, but just some basics. In the 1960s, we've been talking about MT for a long time, machine translation, and translators, professional translators, have basically laughed at machine translation for a long time. That's now past. But the reason they laughed at it for a long time is because the output was not anything close to the output from a professional human translator. In the 1960s, rule-based machine translation came in 1950s. Sorry, I should have started at the very beginning. In the very beginning, 1950s, it was building on World War II code-breaking research. So it was this idea of, oh, we should develop machines to solve the problem of translation. In the 60s, rule-based machine translation era was introduced, and rule-based were linguistic rules. So comparative linguistics was very important. So how do you form a question in English compared to Portuguese? So deconstructing the Portuguese and then reconstructing it into English. In the 70s and 80s, things slowed down, and funding kind of dried up because the promises of the 50s and the 60s were not realized. And basically it was mostly funded by defense. The US Defense Ministry poured a lot of money into it, and the funding dried up because the problem of basically Russian English translation had not been cracked. In the 1990s, though, with the introduction of personal computers and the introduction of statistical research and corpus research, so a lot of linguistic research, translation memories were introduced. And then this idea of, aha, we've got these aligned corpora, we've got a Portuguese source text sentence and an English target text sentence that a professional translator has translated. This is very useful. And so developers started using these bilingual corpora to work on machine translation solutions. And then, the next slide. Statistical machine translation was introduced. I remember really clearly when Google announced statistical machine translation, and there was a big jump. So basically it was based on how probable phrases were in a language. And in academic writing, in English, I'm sure you use things like the Manchester Phrase Bank, which are wonderful resources of phrases or chunks of language that are used repeatedly in academic writing. And that's basically what statistical machine translation was doing. And hybrid machine translation was a combination of the rules, the linguistic rule-based systems, with this statistical information of highly probable sequences of words in a language. And then, boom, in the mid-2000s, neural machine translation. When it had been around for a long time, here it says it goes from fringe research topic in 2014 to a widely adopted technology in 2016. And Google got into the game, and Google invested huge amount of time and money because they saw machine translation as the artificial intelligence prototype. If they could crack machine translation, if they could produce really good quality machine translation, that meant they could do artificial intelligence. So they sort of threw that out to their developers, and lots of very, very smart people got interested. And what we have now is we have unprecedented volumes of content. We've got huge amount of translation happening with machine translation. We have had big gains in quality. We have the problem that there's so much content being translated that it's being fed back into the systems. So that's a new problem. The nicely curated, aligned sentence in Portuguese and sentence in English, that's no longer necessarily being used. Some of the systems are drawing on all these other texts out there, and they're doing stuff from scratch, which is hard to understand. But I've done the basics. So if you know this much about MT systems, I think you're already a big step forward in machine translation literacy. It's been in the news. I don't know if it's been in the news as much in Brazil as it has been in the English-speaking news. It's certainly been in the Swiss news, the French news. So in 2017, translation platforms cannot replace humans, but they are still astonishingly useful. And then in 2018, SDL. SDL is a provider of translation technology, cracks. The quite dramatic terminology, cracks Russian to English neural machine translation. In 2018, DeepL, Cologne-based startup, outperforms Google Translate. It was like, whoa, if you can outperform Google, you're amazing. 2019, Lilt. Lilt is a combined translation memory and machine translation solution designed for translation. Humans at its core, it claims, and then Systrand partners with TED Talks. So suddenly machine translation and artificial intelligence were big, big, big in the news. And for a lot of people, the idea of translation was, the problem of translation was solved. So why bother teaching academic writing in English? Just use machine translation. That would be a simplistic idea. But there are problems. 2017, Facebook translates good morning into attack them, leading to arrest. Palestinian man questioned by Israeli police. That was not so good. 2020, Facebook apologizes for translating Chinese leader the name, and I can't see it. Wait a minute, I have to. There we go. Xi Jinping's name as not very nice. Maybe some of you have similar stories. I don't know if you've been seeing these kinds of things in the news as much, but the reality is NMT output needs to be checked. when we talk about MT literacy and academic English, so I am not a proponent of tell your students just don't bother learning English anymore, just put it into MT. But I do think it could be a very useful tool. And what we think, Alice and I have been talking about this in the lead up to this talk, there are some we think, very promising applications of machine translation output in academic writing teaching itself. So not just telling your students to go ahead and put it through a tool and then post-edit it, fix it, but actually using some examples from MT output to highlight some of the things that you probably think are very typical of academic writing. There are certain things that came to my mind when I thought about academic writing. So information structure issues between languages. Given new or theme ream, German it's often talked about theme ream, in English we talk more about given new structures. If that's not what happens in the source language, machine translation will just more or less give you what you give it as an input. It may not be aware, I'm starting to talk about it as though it's live. Based on its matches, it may not produce the appropriate information structure. Terminology, there are big problems with terminology. Alice has some lovely examples. Differentiated vocabulary, so the machine might come up with a very generic term, where in academic writing you want differentiated vocabulary. Metaphors, especially verbs, have been shown to be an issue with machine translation output. Cohesive devices, how much time do you spend talking about cohesive devices and links and argumentation when you talk about academic writing? That's a problem for machine translation, because it tends, most of the systems that are available, all the systems that are available for free, translate sentence by sentence. So there's no links between the sentence. It might get it right, it might not get it right. And hedging, adverbs, and qualifiers. These are all things that in the day I was teaching academic writing in detail, and certainly as an editor for a journal, these are the typical problems that people have with academic writing, whether it's their native language or not. So I see lots of native English speakers who have problems like this in academic writing. It's not just about people who use English as a second language. The ... is an indication that you might have other things that you would like us to talk about. And I'll turn the floor over to Alice now. And when she's giving the examples, if you have questions or additional examples, please feel free to interrupt.
Thank you, Maureen. So I'm going to go a bit more into detail with these issues regarding academic English and machine translation. But first, I would really like to insist on the fact that because it's quite a long list, and I'm going to be very critical about machine translation, that it's not an argumentation to tell you not to use it, because we use it anyway, and I think there is a great potential there. But it's just, to my opinion, very interesting to know where to look at exactly when we work with MT. So this is the kind of a sum up of the observations that we made in our work in the last couple of years with various language pairs. So let's see, why does it? Okay, so the first big issue, to my opinion, is the issue with the information structure, which I call presenting constructions at the moment. This was something that was already raised by several researchers in translation studies. And this example is from Portuguese, actually, by Johns in 1990, so it's nothing new. But there have been a lot of research on the topic regarding human translation and how to train translators to deal with the information structure. The idea here is that you have these two sentences that are very common in scientific Portuguese, I think. And they both respect two principles: the principle of end weight, which is that you will probably put more communicative dynamism or more information weight towards the end of the sentence. So the more important elements of the sentence are rather towards the end. And the other principle is the principle of end. Oh, that was end focus. I'm sorry, that's end focus. And end weight is a more formal criterion that usually the more complex elements, the longer elements, are rather placed towards the end of the sentence. Of course, these are mere tendencies, but these are principles that are quite current for Portuguese, for Romance languages, and for English as well. In our example, we see that the subject of both sentences in both cases is very long, and is actually the core message of the sentence. So the sentences are merely explaining what has been studied and what has been done, which populations of cultures have been created. When you put it into DeepL or Google Translate, we'll see after that. Well, you end up with a very correct grammatical sentence in English, but you lose both principles. You lose the end weight principle, so that you have a huge subject at the beginning of the sentence and then a very small rest of the sentence. So it's you could think that it's style, but it's not only style, it's also a cognitive load for the reader, because it is not the logical or the more natural flow of information that people are used to have. And the second thing is that the end, that the focus of the sentences is a bit shifted. So apparently, what was interesting in that sentence, in the first sentence, for example, is that the behavior was studied and not what was studied. So this might appear as something that is very trivial for non-academic texts. But if we think of academic texts where you don't have much space, because you can't write tons and tons of text, sometimes you really have a character limit, where you have to be concise and precise, this is really important that you signal what is the new information in your sentence or in your paragraph, and what is actually to be expected. So this is an issue that is raised when you have languages with different word orders, for example. And even worse in that case, if you look at the output of Google Translate, because you can see in the second sentence that the subject was so long that it has been cut in two halves by Google. So there is a segmentation issue there that makes the sentence actually nonsense. So this is an issue, that you have long subjects. They are postponed in Portuguese very often, and that is correct. That is okay. The reader can really follow what the logic is. But then when it's machine translated, generally the machine translator will try to fall back on a subject verb order, more traditional English sentence, and then we will lose many information. So this is one big problem. And another problem, as we said, regards terminology. And here is actually some good news, fresh from a recent study that I started on CRISPR-Cas9, which is a Nobel Prize winning discovery from last year about genetic scissors. So, and what we can see here, this is the machine translated text. It was written in French, and now you have you are looking at the English translation by, if I'm right, by DeepL. What we can see is that all the word that I underlined, genome, CRISPR-Cas9, sequence, enzyme, zinc finger nucleases at the end, or even TALEN, which is an acronym. Well, all of them are actually correctly translated. So it is actually very impressive what machine translation is doing at the moment, because they are really able to to provide accurate translation for academic terminology. So this is actually the good news of the day, probably. But what also happens, and this is an issue that one must really look at in order to see it, is that the vocabulary is narrowing down to the most commonly used words. So we're talking here about genetic scissors, so it's not really surprising that we have cut everywhere in the text. But what's surprising, or what's a bit worrying, is that when we look, for example, at this slide, which is a pedagogical slide for from a colleague who is teaching English for academic purposes for medicine and pharmacy students. If you see the cutting part behind the scissors, you have cleave, cut, make cuts, chop up, remove, get rid of. They also learn trim, and so various synonyms. And if you go back to this machine translation, you only have cut all the time. So this means that there is a loss in the richness of the vocabulary, even regarding terminology. So this is something that one should probably be aware of. And we could say, oh, that's just a style problem, of course, but it's not only regarding the style, because in that example, that is a French part of a text, and it explains that in some DNA sequences, there are series of letters that are immediately followed by other series of letters, but in the other direction. So this is more or less how case 9 works. And the machine translation just uses sequences all the time. So unless you really are a researcher in that area specifically, and then you will notice that there is something wrong with the sentence. Otherwise, you will just not understand anything because it makes no sense. It's very confusing. While the French text was actually trying, by using two different synonyms, to be clear about within a sequence there is a series. So this is an example where this loss of synonyms can really become an issue for the comprehension. The third issue regards metaphors, and this is a special case because we tend to think that metaphors are not really something to be found in academic writing, but actually it is. It is, of course, more frequent to use it when you're trying to explain your work to lay people, such as if you're writing a newspaper article, for example, or vulgarization, popular science works. But it is also important if you're applying for a grant or something like that, because you know that sometimes you will be rated by subject matter experts, but sometimes not. And generally there you will find a lot of metaphors to try and explain in a more simple way what you've been doing. And in the case that we have here, the author wrote that the CRISPR-Cas9 system had been discovered in the 2000s, and then it was used, but in another way. It was not misused, but adapted by the two researchers to use it for biotechnology and gene therapy. The automatic translation said that they hijacked it, which is funny at the same time, but it's also extremely negative. So it also gives the impression that the author doesn't like the two Nobel Prize winners. And this has been made by both DeepL and Google Translate. And I find it specifically interesting because especially verb metaphors are not always easy to spot. Because if you don't know enough English to know that your verb metaphor in Portuguese or in French doesn't work that way in English, then you will have no way to recognize that it is an issue in your machine translation output. This could be an example where we have the French verb croiser. So if a viral RNA crosses path or meets a virus with corresponding DNA, this is the idea in that sentence. And it has been translated with crosses a virus. So if you look at all the definitions of cross, you have, well, you have everything, but it's not meeting, it's not crossing paths with, it's just maybe going through the virus, which is not what was meant, or just making a virus angry, which is probably not what was meant either. But if your English is not good enough to know that cross doesn't have this metaphoric meaning, then it's really difficult to spot that. Fourth, we have this issue with the cohesive devices. What I could observe is that generally these small cohesive words that are at the beginning of a sentence, especially in academic text, they are very important to us because they will allow the reader to understand the relationship, the logical flow between the sentences. And this is something that tends to disappear during translation. And well, for other text types, we could say, okay, that's a filler, that's not a big issue. But for academic writing, we know that this is really important. So the text, the overall text loses cohesion and loses readability because these small words have not been translated. So we see here an example of the German word so, which is quite polysemic. But in that case, it really makes, it really just shows that how the first sentence could be. It's an explanation of the second sentence is an explanation of the first sentence, more or less, with more detail. And you don't have this in the machine translation. So you actually, as a reader, have no idea what the second sentence is about. You have to reconstruct it yourself by reading after you read the two sentences completely. Then you have to try and reconstruct the relationship between A and B. This happens also with French into English translations. For those of you who understand French, this was with en effet, which is also, it seems actually like a very simple word to translate, and it's just gone. And this en effet in that second sentence really shows that the second sentence is a more detailed explanation of the first sentence. So if you don't have that, then you really have two information, two facts that you state without any logical link. So this is an issue. Finally, the most complex issue, to my opinion, because it can manifest in various ways, is hedging. In German, for example, you have the verb soll, which is generally used at the beginning, for example, at the beginning of an abstract or a paper, to state what the aim of the paper is, what the goal of the research is, or what is going to be presented. So generally, you could translate it into English. This is with something like, I will examine, or the author will examine or investigate whether blah, blah, blah. DeepL kind of does that in that case, which is good. The rest of the sentence is not that great, but there is this will, so we have this idea. But in Google Translate, it has been translated by should. If you read this sentence, it should also be investigated whether blah, blah, blah. The sentence doesn't read wrong. It's just, it's not the same, because this sentence means rather corresponds to what you would write at the end of your paper or article, stating recommendations for further research. So here, the issue of hedging is that in that case, just by one wrongly translated modal verb, you will have a complete different stage of your paper. So it will end up in something very confusing. We also have the issue of hedging with adverbs and qualifiers. This was a title in French, CRISPR et les effets hors cible, CRISPR and the off-targets effect, des risques encore peu contrôlables. This encore peu was translated by DeepL with not yet controllable, which is not the same, because in that case, it means that the risks, we have absolutely no control on the risks. It might come later, but at the moment we have absolutely no control. And the author was saying that we have little control. And this has been translated correctly, or at least in the meaning, by Google. finally, another aspect of hedging that is problematic when you work with machine translation is the mode. For example, here in French, this is a conditional sentence which states that 79% of the population is supposed to or allegedly has antibodies against proteins. So this is a conditional, but it has been translated by DeepL in a sense that makes actually no sense, because it would have you would expect an if, so it has really nothing with the allegedly. And Google translates it with a plausible sentence that reads well, but where the allegedly part is completely left out. So you lose the hedging, you lose the idea that no, we are not sure that that percentage of the population have antibodies. In this machine translation, it is sure. So, and to try and sum up what I shared to you and what we've been said, all these issues are, I think there are serious issues that you have to take into account when you consider using MT for academic purposes. But I would really advocate to see them in a positive way, in a meaning that when you know this, especially as a teacher, then you can act upon it, then you can do something. You can, for example, use the modules that have been designed by Lynn Boker and Jairo Buitrago-Ciro to train scholars and researchers. And they had this suggestion to first think about why should we use machine translation in the context of scholarly work? Why is it helping me, or what for? Then probably have this small overview of machine translation systems that we kind of did today. And then the number 3 and number 4 of the steps, translation-friendly writing and editing, and self-post-editing of machine translation output. These are things that I think as a teacher, we can really shape according to what we know. So, and I think this is the teacher's part to decide that, okay, information structure is something that is very important. And maybe this is something that goes into number 3. I want to train people to change the information structure, for example, of the Portuguese text so that it translates better into English, or into number 4. I think these kind of decisions are to be made by the teachers with a didactical pedagogical reflection on it. So I think this is what I presented, and the issues raised by researchers on machine translation should really be communicated very actively to the teachers so that they can integrate this into their teaching and deciding what to do with that. And finally, as Maureen already said, we think that machine translation can also be used as a great tool to enhance academic writing and to learn and keep learning languages and improve the language skills of many persons. For example, as she said, well, being aware of the issues, of specific issues, might help them to write more clearly in the L1. So it could be a part of a training to have one's own text put into the machine translation system and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, then to modify one's own text and in that way, learning how to write in a better way. Or we could also use machine translation output, just as I did more or less, to highlight problems in academic writing and say, okay, information structure is important, or cohesive device is important, because if it disappears during the translation process, then all of a sudden you see that it was important in the first place. And this is where I would like to stop and thank you already, and insist again on the 3 dots are here also, and that represent our questions to you. Do you have experiences, insights, or questions or remarks that you would like to share? Because I think we are at the moment where sharing and exchange are extremely important for good practice. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. I've just added in the chat a link that you might want to explore at some point. Lynn Boker has set up a Google site where she is sharing resources on MT literacy. So if you want to have some more ideas, you can explore there. But yes, please. Do we have any questions? Comments, suggestions?
Okay, so thank you very, very much for this very comprehensive talk, Maureen and Alice. So now we have around, I would say, 20 minutes, check, 20 to 25 minutes for questions and comments. So I will be reading the questions here on the chat. So please feel free to ask and leave your comments.
Or if you want to just turn on your camera and ask.
Yes,
then we get,
yes. If you'd like to switch on
then
your
we get a
cameras.
sense of people. Yeah.
Okay.
We can stop sharing. I think we can probably stop sharing the presentation, Alice.
Okay. Yeah.
So if anyone in the room would like to switch on their cameras. Okay, my colleague Barbara has a question.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much. You gave us a lot of food for thought. I mean, my notes here are all over the place. Being an EAP professor, you know, I have so many things that I would like to mention, but I will refrain myself from doing it. I was thinking about the relationship. I thought about the post-editing and also the writing process, because how machine translation can be used in both stages of writing. For example, sometimes the students, while they are writing, in the process of writing, they might be relying on those resources as well. Mm-hmm. So if you have ever thought about that, what do you think about that? That would be one of the things that came up to my mind as well. And another thing, I'm gonna take the opportunity that I have the floor here and ask two questions. Using MT output in academic writing, when you said the output that we get from machine translation, how can we use it as a teaching strategy as well? You know, the potential of using it as a teaching strategy, that's something that really resonated with me. Then thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to ask the second one, and I'll let you answer the first one, Alice. How's that? Okay. I was just at a talk this morning, and it speaks to this exact question. And the speaker was talking about self-efficacy, so in encouraging students to feel good about what they're doing and to feel confident about what they're doing and make sure that the quality is of the right standard as well. And one of the ways she has observed is making students feel good about things and not exposing themselves to ridicule. And by using machine translation output, you're not exposing the students, you're not taking a student production and saying what doesn't work about this, but one could use machine translation and show it as a text and ask the students, so what works about this and what isn't good about this? And so they're deconstructing, they're finding the problems themselves. And it's not up to the teacher necessarily to say, this is a problem. What we did today, because it's a presentation and it was very much transmissionist, was just to show you and to highlight problems, as Alice did so nicely. But the students could find the problems with the machine translation output. That would be a way I would suggest, because it's not hard to find the problems. Alice, do you want to address this first question?
Yes. I think there are several problems linked to deciding the relationship between post-editing or writing, or what we should be doing, because what we noticed, especially in the project, in a joint project with the UFMG, is that we had some PhD students and some postdocs we had them machine translate an abstract that they had written in their mother tongue, and then translated it with, I think, with DeepL or Google Translate into English. Yeah, and exactly, Google, and then post-edited. And what we noticed is that they corrected things that were actually correct, and left things out that were incorrect. So basically, their post-editing was not efficient at all. And this was the moment where we said, okay, so this would need really a training so that they know what to do, where to look at. So we can, and this then again implies that at some point, when we work with students or with people in general who want to improve their academic writing, that the possibility of post-editing should be really discussed with them very actively, very proactively, that we say, okay, when would you want to use it, at what stage, and that they reflect on their writing process and see where they would fit machine translation in the process, and that the teacher can help saying, okay, if you have it at the end, or if you have it here, what are the risks, and what is the potential, what is great. And the other thing to consider, I think, is this has been noticed by several researchers, but there is one, oh, I forgot the reference, I'm really sorry. It's the idea of priming. And this is a complicated issue, because on the one side, they found that if you expose learners of English, for example, to machine translation, they will probably start learning, especially grammatical constructions that they wouldn't use otherwise. So they would have this priming. It was a research made on the genitive, so on the use of and the genitive with the s, and they really improved in their use, because they had been exposed repeatedly to machine translated outputs. But on the other side, there are also claims that if you use already a machine translation output to write your text, then you have this priming too, which means it can block you. It can block you in what you say. There is this so-called false fluency, where it looks very, very nice. So it is really difficult to make sure that it is accurate. But there are also studies on that. So as we can see, I think this is something that has to be reflected, and where people really have to talk about it and exchange on their experiences, their feelings, and see what happens really when you do it. Yeah, I don't know if it helps, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Helped a lot.
Okay, we have some participants here thanking you for these really interesting, very helpful talk. So Stella Mariah said that. Our colleague, Commander Yahuda, is also thanking you for the very insightful presentations. Ana Lucia Marques, so very enlightening. Thank you for sharing your work and effort to identify and overcome difficulties with machine translation. Would anyone else would like to ask questions or leave comments?
Perhaps I'll just add something to Alice's response about how to use machine translation in academic writing classes. I would encourage teachers to explain the difference between machine translation and online dictionaries. And I'll let you, Alice, take over, because you know more about this.
Yes, this is something that is all over the news in the MT literacy community, so to say, because there have been a lot of studies in the last 12 months, actually, that are starting to be published on how students, especially students, use machine translation systems. And there is one thing that most of the researchers, and including us, found out. It is that the students, and probably the teachers too, sometimes don't really make a big difference between online dictionary and machine translation tool, which means that, for example, they put just one word into Google Translate or DeepL. And this is not the best way to use it, actually. If you know a bit how it works and know that it translates words in context, in the context of the sentence, then you know that it would be better to put a whole sentence, even if you just want the word, because it would probably be more accurate. And the other thing is that, yeah, I had a talk today in my class with the students just to sort it out. What are the advantages of an online dictionaries? And just to not to be old and say online dictionaries are better, but the idea of what is machine learning, what is an algorithm, and what is a dictionary where there are lexicographs that do the work and check everything and develop everything, while in machine translation, for example, it's a machine that does that. So, and I think, and you get different information, and there are various plus sides and downsides to everything. And I think this is a very important topic that we should address in all the classes, in all the language classes. What are the tools that we use, and try to encourage students and participants not only to not only focus on one tool, but to think of using two, for example, and knowing why they use two, why they double check, for example. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I'll switch to Portuguese just for a while. Se alguém quiser fazer alguma pergunta em português no chat, eu posso, né, tentar traduzir, assim ficarem mais confortáveis. Algum comentário? Let's then switch back to English.
Alice can handle Portuguese. I can't.
Well, you can read it at least.
That's true.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was quite impressed with your talk, and because as you were, I mean, I thought it was a very comprehensive, because you got the basics of machine translation, like the personal timeline, and then it was very interesting the way you switched that into possible ways of teaching academic writing through machine translation. So I myself here am very interested in that. And I know that, well, I would say that more research is needed, especially if we compare L1 writing and switching to L2 through machine translation, and also L2 writing. So in this case, English academic writing. So, well, I'm trying to maybe have a deeper look. So I have this research project. It's really based on the one that we had two years ago. So I'd like to expand on that. But what my comment is that here, the students, even though they're not aware of pre-editing and post-editing, or some of them are not, let's say, theoretically aware, what I can see from my students is that they do use machine translation for their tasks, or for their assignments. And I can see that clearly in their texts. And then I was I just feel the need that we do need to not only do more research, I would say theoretical and empirical research on that, but also how to make the students aware of machine translation processes. And I think the examples Alice brought us were very, very interesting. And of course, we do need to have a very critical look on that. And I think it was very, very, very interesting. Very thought-provoking. I myself am thinking here of maybe projects or workshops that we could give offer to the students. But I do feel that we need more research on that. Yeah.
What is very important is instead of condemning MT and the use of MT and making it, demonizing it, we should embrace it. It's a reality. It's out there.
Yes.
Everyone's using it. I use it to
Yes.
write my German, and my German has gotten so much better because the MT, the neural machine translation systems are very good at morphology. And German, if any of you know German, morphology is very complicated. And you have to know whether something is masculine, feminine, neuter, whether it's in the accusative, the nominative, the genitive. And it was just too much for me when I started learning German to cope with all of that. But MT can do that. It can do that really easily. So I know what I want to say in German. I know the nouns and the verbs I want to use. So I write my English that way. So the machine translation will produce it, and it does all of the grammatical niceties. And from that, I learn. That's right. I remember that now because it's my production. Whereas if it's just wrong and I get it back from the teacher and it's just wrong, it doesn't necessarily make me feel very motivated. But it's very empowering, actually, I think, to a student to realize they can produce grammatically correct sentences the way they want them to sound.
Absolutely. And I would just add another small food for thought, because sometimes I don't want to acknowledge it. When we did the survey among the Swiss universities, we asked people if they were using MT, and they all use it. I think it's 97% for both teachers and students. And there is a great study by Errol O'Neill, he published in 2019. He had his survey on 300 students, and he asked them, I don't know how we managed to do that, but he asked them about their use of online dictionaries, online translation tools, and online sites like Wikipedia or Google. And he asked them when they would use it. And what was interesting, 87% of the students claimed that they would be using online dictionaries and online machine translation tools for non-graded assessment, but also for graded assignments. And the thing is, in that university, for graded assignments, it was forbidden to use MT. And yet, almost 90% of the students, when they were asked, they said that they used it. So it's not only that they use it, but they also, I think that they kind of thought that it's normal. And so it's no use to just ignore it, because they will be using it, and then we lose a great chance to get a new tool that's completely free. We don't have to license it, and just to make the best out of it. And I think there is a huge potential that we just have touched at the moment. Yeah.
And what we didn't talk about, but you would have to include in MT literacy training, is that when you put a text into Google, it's now, it is then owned by Google. So anything you put into Google is Google's, and students need to be aware of that. Now, that may not be a problem for a first-year student, but it is a problem for a PhD student or a postdoc or a researcher who wants their abstract published somewhere else, and they've put it out there, and it's public knowledge. There are licensed versions, of course. We have a DeepL license at our university, but you still need to be careful. But putting in individual sentences, putting in phrases, that's not a problem. But putting in whole texts, that can be a problem.
It's very true. So I was just wondering at which point we are at regarding machine translation, near machine translation technologies. Is the example that Alice gave on the theme so the example of the Portuguese English translation, whereas in Portuguese we had so if you consider voice, we had passive voice, and then it was also translated into the same linguistic structure as a passive. Then I was just wondering if the near machine translation systems could, I don't know, of course, this is a very technical comment or question. Voice is something that, for example, could be changed. So from passive to active voice, I was just wondering if that was active. So maybe it could be better read in English. So I was just wondering if those initiatives like the DeepL and Google Translate and all the computational linguistic researches are into that.
The custom-made systems, you can program things like that. They take a lot more effort to program. So that's why there is a market for producers of NMT. It isn't that Google and DeepL have done it and the problem is solved, because exactly these sorts of issues, or a company wants their own terminology, or the difference between formal and informal in so many of the languages. Not in English, you is you, but DeepL now offers a feature that you can have it formal or informal, but you have to pay for it. That's how DeepL makes money. It's not just free. As soon as you want to get some of these nice features, you're going to pay for it. But yes, they are developing in this direction because they realize, yes, they've done a job. And some people claim it's sort of 70 to 80% usable. Depending on the text, it might be even higher, but they haven't cracked that. And somebody's going to make money with that. So there's a lot of work out there for linguists too.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Yes. Okay, so would anyone else would like to ask questions or make comments? So Eduardo Maroca, so thanks for your presentation. I work with French and I would like to know if there is a language that causes more problems than others when they're being dealing dealing with in machine translation, when they're being dealt with in machine translation. Is there any
it depends on it depends on the combination. I don't know, maybe Alice, you know which ones are problematic for French. A lot of work has been done with English. So if you test things with English, you might be really impressed. If you test with other languages, you might not be so impressed. So if you try German, Japanese, it may not be as convincing as Japanese English or German English. But I'll turn it over to Alice for the French.
Yeah, no, absolutely. French is actually not a huge problem for English and for Portuguese, but it's really depending on the language pair. So the idea, for example, is if you have much smaller languages, let's say Romansh, the fourth national Swiss language, at the moment we don't have any neural machine translation system on that. And the less distributed languages are generally have less proficient machine translations, even if it's neural, but it's mainly because there aren't that much data. But yeah, I mean, what one should bear in mind is generally the machine translation systems still work with English as a middle way. So sometimes when you do a translation from, let's say, Spanish or Portuguese into French, something that you would have translated in a very simple way, because sometimes they're really quite parallel, not always, but sometimes, all of a sudden becomes quite weird, and it's because English was in the middle and you don't know it. So that's an issue that that should be raised too, because it always goes through English, and this is something that you can see, especially if you're working with gendered things, with nurses and doctors and whatever. Because even if you have the right gender in French, for example, if it goes through English, it loses the gender. So if you have un docteur, it becomes a doctor, and then it translates back into Portuguese, and then it becomes a male doctor, even if it was a female doctor in French. So they're trying to fix that, but they don't fix it all the time, because they can't get everything of it. So that's something that one has to know, to think about, some features of the language. But basically, the idea is we will need a little more contrastive knowledge and language typological knowledge as teachers and as language professionals to deal with machine translation and understand when it doesn't work and when it works. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, so thanking you for the answer.
De rien.
Okay. So would anyone like to ask the last question? Alguém teria mais alguma pergunta? No? Okay, so I'd like to thank you, Maureen, and Alice very, very, very much. So I cannot thank you enough for taking part in our event. And well, that was for myself, and I'm sure that for all the others, that was a very deep and insightful talk. And do wish that we continue our contact. But we're actually carry on with writing that paper. So just a little bit behind schedule, but
Understandably.
Get back on track. Well, I'd like now to invite our participants to join the simultaneous sessions, the parallel sessions. And of course, would like to invite you to join us as well if you can.
Thank you.
And once again, thank you very much for this great opportunity. And everyone learned a lot from you. Thank you.
I'm glad.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thanks. Okay.
Bye, thanks.